night Gerald Hartmann screamed, I was 2 rooms away. It was 3:47 in the morning. I know the time because I checked the wall clock the moment I heard it, the way nurses do when something unexpected happens. You timestamp everything, even the things you can't explain. His room had been quiet for hours, that kind of deep night quiet that only exists in palliative units, the IV pumps breathing steadily, the monitors reporting in soft, measured tones, the rain tapping the window above the courtyard. Gerald had been sleeping most of the time by then. Stage 4 pancreatic carcinoma, liver involvement, peritoneal spread. We were no longer in the business of reversing anything. We were keeping him comfortable. The scream wasn't pain. I need to tell you that right away, because that's what I assumed as I ran. 22 years in critical care, you learn to read a scream from 30 feet. Pain sounds different. Fear sounds different. They have a particular quality. Raw, compressed, like the body trying to expel something from the inside. This wasn't that. This sounded like surprise. Who are all these people? I pushed open his door. Gerald was sitting upright in bed, something he hadn't managed on his own in 4 days, eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room near the window. His room was empty. Let me tell you who Gerald was before I tell you what happened next, because who he was matters. 71 years old, retired professor of computational physics, 35 years at UC Santa Barbara. He'd published over 90 peer-reviewed papers. His son, there was only one, Daniel, who flew in from Boston the second week, told me his father's office had a whiteboard that covered 3 walls, floor to ceiling, covered in notation that nobody else could read. Daniel also said quietly on his second evening there, "My father thought heaven was a fairy tale for people who couldn't do math." Gerald had made no secret of this. His colleagues described him as brilliant and unsparing, a man who had organized his entire intellectual life around the idea that what you can measure is what is real, and what you can't measure is what people invent when they're frightened of what they don't know. He'd said as much in print, in a piece he'd written for a university journal early in his career. The universe does not owe us a continuation. He was admitted to our unit 2 weeks before this night. Pancreatic carcinoma with hepatic and peritoneal metastases, Glasgow coma scale fluctuating between 11 and 13, which meant he had windows, sometimes an hour, sometimes more, of genuine lucidity. He recognized people, tracked conversations, corrected the pronunciation of his own name when a resident got it slightly wrong. He was on morphine for pain control, 4 milligrams IV every 4 hours, dexamethasone for inflammation management, no benzodiazepines, no ketamine, nothing with a significant hallucinogenic profile in the pharmacological literature. I want you to understand that, because what I'm about to describe is not a medication side effect. I've watched patients in opioid-induced delirium. It presents in a specific pattern: disorientation to person, place and time, agitation that persists and escalates, sometimes paranoia, sometimes sundowning that worsens as the night deepens. The confusion is generalized. The content is fragmented. Gerald's episodes didn't work like that. They worked like he was attending a meeting he hadn't been told about. After the first night, after I got his vitals documented, blood pressure 94/58, heart rate 88, oxygen saturation at 91%, all consistent with his baseline. I asked him what he'd seen. He looked at me for a long moment. The way he looked at me, I got the sense he was deciding how to answer someone whose framework he didn't entirely trust. "People," he said. I asked if he recognized any of them. "A few." He described someone he called an old colleague from the early years, someone he had argued with constantly about methodology, about interpretation, about what data meant and didn't mean. He said the man looked well, better than he'd looked in life, which was apparently easy since he'd always looked, in Gerald's words, like he needed another decade of sleep. I asked if he could describe anyone else. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there was a woman, physics. She had something to do with Pittsburgh. He said she was short, dark hair cut very close to her head, always looked impatient, even standing in his hospital room. Right now, she looked like she had somewhere else to be. Though, he added, in that careful, precise way of his, she doesn't appear to be leaving. He didn't know her name. He thought they might have met at a conference years ago, something in the 1990s. He wasn't certain. I wrote it all down. The next afternoon, I got in early and asked Daniel if I could speak with him in the family room. I didn't know how to frame what I was about to ask, so I just said it plainly. Your father is describing people in his room that I cannot see. He's been consistent about this, not random, not confused in the standard clinical way. Is there anyone in his professional history, someone in physics, possibly connected to Pittsburgh, who passed away before him? Daniel looked at me for a moment. I don't know his colleagues, he said. He and I weren't... He stopped. Started again. We weren't close, but I could make some calls. He made some calls. 2 days later, he came back to me with a name. Dr. Angela Reyes, computational physics, Carnegie Mellon University, which is in Pittsburgh. She had died in 2003, a stroke, in her late 40s. She and Gerald had been in the same research spaces, the same conferences, for most of the 1990s. A colleague of Gerald's who had known them both described her, unprompted, as famously impatient. The kind of person who would interrupt your theorem in the middle of a proof to tell you it was going in the wrong direction. Daniel had never heard her name before. He had no prior knowledge of her, no photographs, no stories. His father had not been the kind of man who brought his professional life home, and home was not a place they'd spent much time in together. But the physical description his father had given from his hospital bed, short, dark hair, cut close, perpetually impatient, matched the woman his father's colleagues remembered. Here's what I need you to understand about what I was looking at clinically. Delirium generates noise, fragmented imagery, non-sequential content, people who don't exist or are misidentified, conversations that loop without logic. That's what hypoxic or pharmacologically induced confusion looks like from the nursing side. What Gerald was doing was something else. He was describing specific people, people with physical characteristics, people with identifiable personalities, and at least one of them, a woman his son had never heard of, whose connection to Pittsburgh his son did not know, turned out to be verifiably real, verifiably dead, and verifiably consistent with the description he gave. I want to tell you about a researcher whose work I didn't encounter until after my own experience in 2019, when I started reading everything I'd ignored for 22 years. Dr. Peter Fenwick was a neuropsychiatrist at King's College London. He spent decades collecting documented accounts of what happens in the hours and days before death, not from patients who survive cardiac arrest, but from people actively dying, in hospices, in palliative care units, in nursing homes. He ended up with a database of roughly 2,000 accounts. His book is called The Art of Dying. One of the things he found was this: somewhere between 50 and 60% of conscious hospice patients report what he called end-of-life visitations. Not dreams in the conventional sense. Experiences where the dying person describes, in specific, coherent terms, seeing people who have died before them. Parents, siblings, old colleagues. Sometimes people they hadn't thought about in decades. Sometimes groups of people filling the room. He found that this happened regardless of prior religious belief. He found it in people who had spent their entire lives saying exactly what Gerald had spent his life saying. A 2014 study by Dr. Christopher Kerr and colleagues at Hospice Buffalo, one of the most rigorous prospective studies done on this, followed 59 hospice patients over the course of their dying. 88% of them reported at least one visitation experience. The most common content by far was deceased relatives, not fears, not fantasies, people they had known and lost. And the nurse researcher Penny Sartori, who spent 5 years in a Welsh ICU running one of the most careful prospective studies ever done on near-death experiences in clinical settings, found something that keeps staying with me. The visions weren't random. The patients weren't seeing whoever happened to be in the room. They weren't seeing people who were alive. They were almost always seeing people who were dead. Specifically, precisely dead. People they had known in life. The brain under metabolic stress does not preferentially generate content about specific dead people. It generates noise. The specificity here, the accuracy, the consistency, the verifiability, is not what neurological disruption produces. I don't have a clean explanation for that. I'm a retired ICU nurse, not a philosopher of mind. But I stopped needing a clean explanation somewhere along the way. Here's what I want to tell you about the fear. Not Gerald's. Mine. For most of my nursing career, the thing I was most quietly afraid of, more than pain, more than the slow erosion of self that disease can bring, was the loneliness of dying. The specific, structural loneliness of it. The idea that when you reach the actual moment of crossing, you reach it alone. That even if the people who love you are standing in the room, even if there's a hand in yours, the threshold itself is a place they can't follow you to. That you go through it in a way that is, fundamentally, singular and unrepeatable and unaccompanied. I carried that fear through 22 years of holding people's hands as they got there. Gerald didn't seem lonely. That's the thing that stayed with me, standing in the doorway of his room at 3:47 in the morning. He was sitting upright, looking at a corner of the room that appeared completely empty to me, and his expression wasn't terror. It wasn't the hollowed-out confusion of a man whose brain was misfiring. He looked genuinely surprised. He looked like a man who had expected to walk into a quiet room and found it full. On the fourth day, Daniel was there during one of his father's clearer windows. Gerald looked at him, really looked at him, the way he hadn't in days, and said quietly, as though this was something he'd been sitting with for a while and had finally decided was worth saying out loud. They're not impatient, that's the strange part. For people who have somewhere to be, they're not in any hurry. Daniel told me afterward he didn't know how to answer that. He just held his father's hand. Gerald died on the fifth day, early morning, 6:14 a.m. Daniel was there. The monitors documented it cleanly. The rhythm changed, then the line. Before he'd gone fully under that last time, he'd said something. Daniel told me this in the hallway afterward, still in his coat, not quite ready to go anywhere. His father had been quiet for an hour. Then, without opening his eyes, very softly, "There really are a lot of them." I've thought about that phrase for a long time. He came into that unit a man who had built his entire intellectual life around the proposition that when it ends, it ends. Full stop. No continuation, no reunion, no room full of anyone. And I don't know what he believed when he left it. I'm not sure belief is even the right category for what those 4 days changed in him. He was a physicist. He worked in observation and evidence. He described what he observed. What he observed was that the room wasn't empty. If you're watching this because someone you love has died and you're afraid they made that crossing alone, I want you to hear that one more time, not as comfort. As the account of a clinically trained observer watching something she could not account for with her training. A man who would have found comfort unconvincing, who spent a career dismantling arguments he considered soft, told me 5 times over 4 days that the room was full. The first time, he asked who they were. The last time, he already knew.